Thanks for that, Keith. A couple of hard acts to follow there. I'll do my best. I might just take this off because it's kind of annoying. So I'll just firstly thanks Keith for the introduction, and thanks everyone for turning up today and listening to this. I just want to acknowledge my co-authors here, so Andrew Ash, Tony Grice, Andrew Higgins, Lee Hunt, Kewan Pethram and Peter Stone. For some of you and for some producers in southeast Queensland, this question's a bit of a no-brainer. I mean, many people live on very intensively managed properties with a diversification of income streams. But for others, this will be complete anathema. People run large properties in northern Australia and they own them to run beef cattle and to produce beef only. It's one of the reasons people live there. So the idea of doing something other than producing beef cattle is of little interest to them. I'm a little worried about the talk being probably more politics and strategy than science, but I think it's really important because it lays out some of the thinking at Commonwealth, at state and Northern Territory level, and some of the kind of the regional, the industry, local government and research organisation perspectives about this imperative to develop the North. I'll touch on 3 projects in particular towards the end of the talk, so the North Queensland Irrigated Agriculture Strategy, the Mosaic AG project, and a project around improving livestock logistics. But first, I guess I need to define what's meant by intensification. Intensification is about deliberately increasing input costs through a change in the type or an increase in the number of inputs with the aim of producing sufficiently higher returns to justify those increased costs. So intensification, at least in terms of pastoral activities, is a fairly loosely defined term. Essentially, it refers to any change in activity that requires higher inputs than are currently used. And livestock grazing in Northern Australia has traditionally been an extensive low input system, but intensification suggests more closely managed. And it's not new to the industry. The industry has been becoming more intensively managed ever since the industry began. So if you look at that figure up in the top right-hand corner, that's Ord Station around about the time of the Second World War. It has a boundary fence, it has one internal fence. I think it's got one artificial water near the homestead, and the rest of the waters come off of pools and rock holes and springs and things. And of course, over time, properties develop, they get paddocks, they get artificial waters and become much more intensively managed. But it also includes all sorts of other things, and in fact, a whole bunch of really good examples there in Troy Setter's talk about deliberately increasing costs within the system, but with the expectation that you get higher returns from them. It can also include substantial alterations to the enterprise, such as growing hay or forage, using small-scale irrigation, or even potentially types of tourism activities associated with the beef enterprise. There's a fair bit of pressure from communities and government to develop the North. There's nothing new in this. It's generally seen as a whole bunch of untapped soil and water opportunities for agriculture development. It's seen as a key part of Australia's response to the Asian century, to food security and to nation building. And that nation building role was really important in the early 20th century, but actually continued throughout most of the 20th century and has got a renewed importance in the 21st. For me, this is a really interesting and an actual example of where government, and it's more or less bipartisan and more or less, well, no, more than less, right across the jurisdictions and across regional development authorities and things, is where the political intent is meeting science, meeting the demands of the locals and actually providing some funds to do the research with a very clear outcome in mind, and that's what I'll take you through in this talk. Today, at least, I just want to make the point, though, that I want to make the distinction, I guess, between large-scale agricultural development and small-scale development that would be an adjunct to the individual beef enterprise. So I'm not talking today about schemes which drastically change land use, such as the Ord or the Burdekin that you can see here, or some of the larger proposals that are being espoused at the moment in the media. I mean, those schemes might have their place, but they're not the subject of today's presentation. So today I'm definitely talking within the context of the northern beef industry, and not simply talking about changing from one land use to another. Now, I mean, this impetus for the intensification of the North and for the intensification of the northern beef industry isn't new, as I said, but I think there is a new recognition of the role of the beef industry in this development. And that's actually a bit new to what it's been in the past. So from an institutional perspective, the idea of promoting intensification of the northern beef industry was given significant impetus by the Northern Australian Land and Water Task Force, which reported to the Commonwealth Government in 2009. The task force was begun under the Howard government with Bill Heffernan as chair and then continued under the initial Rudd government with Joe Ross as chair. The task force foresaw a significant increase in the gross value of agricultural production from the north. This growth will be helped by improved transport infrastructure, harmonisation of regulatory frameworks across jurisdictions and changed agricultural systems. And specifically for the pastoral industry, the task force saw a real opportunity for beef enterprises to implement small-scale irrigation systems, termed Mosaic agriculture, to provide increased feed, different turn-off strategies and diversification of income. And that wasn't just talk. One of the direct responses to the task force's report was the formation of the Northern Australian Ministerial Forum. The forum's convened by the Commonwealth Minister responsible for regional development, and originally it was Simon Crean, and includes the relevant primary industry or regional development ministers from WA, Queensland and the Northern Territory. The forum meets frequently, it's very active and it does stuff. It's not one of these things which has been set up just as in name only. It's driven quite hard by the chair, and particularly Simon Crean when he was chair. And I haven't been to the forum myself, but I'm told that it runs very well and it really runs on the spirit of actually trying to get something done. The NAM for the Ministerial Forum has also established the Northern Australian Sustainable Futures program that contains a whole bunch of projects deliberately aimed at fostering the development of Northern Australia, and many of these having a specific aim of doing that through the northern beef industry. So those top three projects there I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. But ABARES have done quite a large study on the contemporary risks and opportunities facing the northern beef industry. There's been work done in fact, a whole range of different bits of work done on increasing meat processing capacity in northern Australia, some capacity building work on those links between Australia and Indonesia. There's land tenure reform, there's work on Indigenous pastoral opportunities, and there's some new work being done at the moment on food and fibre supply chains, which Andrew Ash, somewhere in the audience here, is leading. And like you, or like me perhaps, my eyes tend to glaze over a little bit when I hear of programs and strategies and policies and a whole bunch of acronyms. But I will just keep with that for a little while, because this demonstrates the kind of local and regional and local government support for doing this work. So that top right one is, I'm specifically talking here about the Flinders and Gilbert work. So they're two catchments in the Gulf region of Queensland. The Mount Isa to Townsville Economic Development Zone, so most of that Flinders catchment, has been pushing for some time this idea of opening up pastoral land for small-scale irrigated agriculture, and a number of graziers in that Flinders catchment have formed the FRAP, so the Flinders River Agricultural Precinct Group. And while it is called a precinct, it is very much about individual small-scale operations on individual grazing properties, and getting kind of some benefits of scale and of cooperation across those individual bits of mosaics. In the Gilbert, the Gulf Savannah development, people have been pushing a similar sort of thing and put up a prospectus in 2009, I think. And the Queensland government's done a fair bit of work in the past on working out just how much water is available and what it might be used for, and put out a water resources plan in 2007. So at the same time, we've got a lot of local and local government impetus for this. You've also got that very high level Commonwealth and cross-jurisdiction impetus. I mentioned before that this renewed focus on developing the north through and this new focus on doing it through the beef industry, you have to think about why. So firstly, by land area, beef's by far the dominant land use across northern Australia. There's a real recognition, I think, that it has survived despite adversity for a long time and looks set to survive into the future. It supports the social and regional infrastructure beyond towns, mines, Indigenous communities and tourist hotspots. And history's shown, through failure, that the introduction of new ventures in isolation has often come at some cost. And I think also there's a recognition that the beef industry can do with some support from government. So it's already there, it's been successful over a long period, and there is an opportunity to build on it and to do some different things. And we heard yesterday in the NABRIC meeting from Alan Dale, who's chair of the Regional Development Authority up here in North Queensland. He said that the future of the beef industry is at the heart of the future of Northern Australia. So I guess it just highlights to me that this continued push to develop the north really needs to be done with and through the beef industry, as well as in other bits as well. One thing that's a little bit harder for me to provide evidence for, I guess, is a changing attitude to doing extra things on some of these northern grazing properties. And I talked to someone last night at dinner who was intending to do a bit of work on their place, and he talked about it as a paradigm shift. That I said, well, why hasn't it been done before? And he said, well, I think it's kind of a paradigm shift in the way we've thought about what we might do with these properties. But in my time in the pastoral industry, I've seen a fair change in the attitude to the idea that pastoral areas don't just run livestock, that they might do something else. John Holmes has captured this in a paper he calls a multifunctional transition, where he's looked at changes in land use, land ownership, and sometimes land tenure over that 30-year period from 76 to 2006, and documented those large changes that many of you will be aware of. To me, when I first joined the Department of Agriculture in WA, there was this idea that pastoralism was a residual land use, that you ran livestock until you could think of something better to do with the land, and the Land Act really reinforced that. But what we've seen in the last few years is a recognition and a real change in view by state and Northern Territory governments to go through a land tenure reform process, and I think of it as saying diversification is no longer a dirty word. So there's a really strong view that pastoral land tenure, particularly leasehold tenure, can support things other than livestock raising. But what about the mistakes of the past? And so we've damaged large areas of southern Australia already by overdevelopment and over-extraction of water resources. We've tried irrigated agriculture in northern Australia, and the list of failures is greater than the list of successes. But we're not looking to change from running cattle to running lots of green circles. We're not talking about anything like this level of intensification. So if I just look at a particular plot, a particular piece of agricultural development out of Richmond, Silver Hills Station, many of you will know it. That green rectangle down here is an off-stream storage. It's kind of 1.5 kilometres by about 500 metres. It's quite big. It irrigates I don't know exactly, but sort of 400 or 500 hectares of land, and the grazier there, Corbett Tritton's grown cotton, mung beans, forages and things over a long period of time. And I don't know what it cost, but back of the envelope calculation would suggest several $1 million to set that up. It's a big operation, and it's a big addition to an individual grazing enterprise. But if you start to look at it in the matrix of the rest of the grazing and pastoral matrix, it soon very quickly disappears into the background. And even if you had 10 or 15 places along that Flinders River doing something of that scale, it would actually be a major change to that local community, but it really doesn't change the pastoral landscape all that much at this kind of scale. And I know it's a little bit disingenuous to do this, to pull out and just zoom back and it disappears, but I guess, and for this audience in particular who knows Northern Australia and knows the kinds of distances and scale we're talking about, it is a bit disingenuous to show this, but for other audiences, to even mention any kind of intensification and irrigated agriculture on pastoral leases is to conjure up images of all those green circles. So I just wanted to make the point that we're not talking about that. There are things different about 2013, I think. Fortunately, the current enthusiasm for intensification of beef enterprises in Northern Australia is being supported by integrated and coordinated science that's helping to scope and quantify many of the opportunities and risks. So there's social, cultural and biophysical research being done, not just agronomic, to examine the resources that are available and what the impacts of development might be. So thereby allowing the community at large, through government, to start to make some decisions about the trade-offs and synergies associated with using natural resources differently to how we use them now. And the comprehensive nature of the North Queensland Irrigated Agriculture Strategy, which I'll get to in a minute, is an attempt to address the criticism that previous research for northern development failed to address long-term sustainability issues, Indigenous interests, economic viability and environmental consequences. And I think the other thing to think is that there's actually now a better understanding, I guess, of the range of aspirations and opportunities from beef producers, and also, I guess, the range of aspirations and opportunities from the government that sits behind it, from people who just want to produce a bit of hay off a single pivot to use for their own purposes, right through to some quite large-scale, game-changing agricultural development. And the system should be able to cope with that entire range. So to move on to just some very quick summaries of the projects, the North Queensland Irrigated Agriculture Strategy, this was announced in 2011 by the then Premier Anna Bligh and by the then Regional Development Minister Simon Crean. at Corbett Tritton's property at Silver Hills, and that was that one I showed you from zooming out before. It's a $10 million strategy designed to assess the scale of the opportunity for irrigated agriculture in the Flinders and Gilbert catchments of the Gulf. And while it was recognised by the NAMF, who funded this, that a range of crops and forages, including cotton, peanuts, pulses, hay and even tree crops might be grown, the strategy was deliberately focused on irrigated agriculture as an adjunct to existing beef enterprises rather than some kind of separate irrigation development in its own right. And it was a collaborative initiative between the Office of Northern Australia and the Queensland Government Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. There's lots of activities in it, and it's been done over a fairly short time, but you can largely group those activities in three areas. So one's about resource assessment. So what soil and resources are available to do this? Another bunch of activities is around economic viability, and then the third bunch of activities, and there's some links between them of course, around the question about to what extent it's sustainable. Just to quickly take you through some of these things and some of the research that's being done. So the first part of it is resource assessment. So that's looking firstly at the climate and the potential future climate for these two catchments. And then a series of things, so geophysics is one of them where, and this is fairly, to me anyway, kind of gee whiz science. This is flying flight lines underneath helicopters. I think that we did about 1,500 traverse kilometres of this to look for things like the salts in the soil profile that might be a problem on irrigated agriculture, the surface to groundwater connectivity, and the underlying geology to help better understand the aquifers and the groundwater systems. The soil mapping and land suitability work is actually the first application, or the first large-scale application in the world, I think, of the 21st century way of producing soil maps called digital soils mapping. And CSIRO and the Queensland Government are doing this. Beck Bartley, sitting up the back there, is leading this work. So given the really large size of these two catchments, the amount of time we had and the dollars we had, it's impossible to do those kind of old-style soil surveys where you just go out and you sample on a fairly regular basis over a period of multiple years and then take a few more multiple years to write up the report. With the digital soil mapping, you use a whole bunch of existing layers, so geology maps, digital elevation models, radiometrics, all sorts of things, to produce a kind of a model of what kind of soils you expect to see in what sorts of places. And some of them are pretty obvious. You expect particular kind of soil in alluvial systems, for example, and you know a bit more about it if you know what the hills they're coming from look like. And then getting out in the field and really being really targeted about your soil sampling in the field with the drilling rig to make sure that you're both validating the model but not wasting time drilling holes where they're not needed. CSIRO, again, with the Queensland Government, have built river system models of the Flinders and Gilbert rivers. And so having now produced these models, and there that's the model for that shows the Flinders River, and the thickness of the line tells you something about the mean annual flow of water in the Flinders. So now having produced those models and got them calibrated, it's now possible to examine a whole range of different development scenarios. So what would it mean if we took this much water in these parts of the catchment at this time of the year, and we want to be able to do it in something like 8 years out of 10? What would that mean downstream, and what sort of impact would that have on a whole bunch of different things? We're also looking at the economic viability. So some of the basic agricultural productivity work, the agronomic work. In the time we've got and the resources we've got, a lot of this is through agronomic modelling, but we're also collecting data from some of the stuff that's being grown there now in both the Gilbert and the Flinders. Irrigation infrastructure, so but as well as looking at potential dam sites and a distributed network of Mosaic AG down from that, also looking at the potential for off-stream storage by individual graziers. And then the socio-economics, so not only looking at the costs and benefits at the enterprise scale, but also a bit more of the social sort of studies around this really interesting question about the change graziers need to make. Someone talked about taking their bigger Cooper off and putting sort of terry-toweling farmer's hat on to grow stuff. So you actually have to make a mindset change about the way you run the place. And also then the regional development aspect. So what would it mean to towns like Hughenden and Richmond if there was a fair bit of development along that Flinders River? I'm obviously not pointing it in the right place. There you go. And sustainability, and there's a fair bit of work going into sustainability. So James Cook University are doing the aquatic and riparian ecology work. We spend a lot of time on Indigenous water values and in talking to Indigenous people in these catchments about what they see as the future for the water and soils and how they might fit. A A fair bit on flood mapping and modelling. You may well find a fantastic site to do something, and you may grow a lot of stuff and it might be very profitable, but if it gets taken away by a flood and you lose your infrastructure, then you're going to wipe the system out. The groundwater connectivity is really important in these two catchments. They provide a lot of the base flow to the rivers in the dry period. They keep the dry season pools going in the dry period. And those dry season pools are, of course, important refugia for biodiversity and for the health of the river. And there's also some work going on triple bottom line accounting and ecosystem services stuff. I've got a single slide here on a Mosaic AG project. So this is looking across all of Northern Australia, not just the Flinders and Gilbert. Again, this is something which came directly out of the task force, and it basically says finding large areas of contiguous good soils in Northern Australia is difficult, but there is good water and good soils in pockets across the north. And the beef industry has the capacity to make use of this, and there are some good examples across the north of people who are doing it and doing well. By either enhancing their beef enterprise by growing hay, which they might, or forage or sorghum or something which they might use on station, but also providing a different income stream. And there's a whole bunch of constraints and opportunities here. So this project is looking at what those are. And really, to me, it's asking the question, is it a goer or is it a bit of a pipe dream? I'd be really keen, and Neil McLeod, who's working on the project also, he's here somewhere, really keen to hear from any of you over the course of the next couple of days about your experiences with this, successes, failures, whatever. So by all means, I'm one of the ones with these silly things. And then a project looking at livestock logistics. So Troy also set out really nicely the incredible costs involved in carting cattle around and some of the inefficiencies in the transport supply chain. So another project to come out of NAMF is looking at the whole northern beef supply chain, and then working with meat processors, some of the large corporates and some of the government departments to come up with a set of logistics questions, and then work our way through how it might be addressed by this model. So essentially, how can road, rail, yards and ports best be improved? Where are the transport pinch points? Where are small things happening which are making a large difference to costs and times and things for transport? And if you had $10 million in your back pocket, where would you best spend it of all the places you could spend it? And then some what-if scenarios. So what if you built a Darwin south of abattoir? What if live export changed? What would that mean for transport infrastructure? And how would you need to be prepared for it in terms of making sure you had the capacity? And then some of the flow-on effects. I mean, it's mostly a physical project, but there's also quite a bit in there about capital investment, the political realities of where funding goes, and the regulatory structures. There's a huge amount of inputs go into this, and I won't go through this slide, but we've been really fortunate to get hold of NLIS data over the last 5 years and to match that up with property identification data, to get really good roads data and understand what truck configurations are allowed on what roads tend to get cut off in the wet season, where the pinch points are, a whole bunch of stuff about yards and abattoirs and shipping facilities, and then some of the legislative stuff and regulations around animal welfare, ticks, fatigue management and load restrictions. And we've actually produced the entire, I say entire, for Queensland, the Territory and for the northern part of WA, the transport supply chain. So this is just a static map, but inbuilt in all of this is this enormous amount of data which allows us to look at all those trips. So if you think about in the last 5 years, all the property to property movements, property to abattoir, yard to abattoir, depot to port, all those things are captured in this. Even I noticed this morning when I was having a look, some abattoir to abattoir movements. So you can really see over the last 5 years where cattle have come from and where they're going to. And then you can use it for a whole bunch of problems, but there's a very simple example here. This is simulated data rather than NLIS. Again, the thickness of the line shows you something about the number of cattle, and the Kimberley going up to a yard in Katherine in Queensland, going down to abattoirs in Brisbane. And you can say, well, what happens if these roads are cut for whatever reason? What does that mean to the transport costs, the transport distances and the time it takes? And you can do it kind of in the reverse. So if there's a particular pinch point in terms of a road that is closed more frequently than it should be, or a culvert or a bridge that's not up to scratch, then what difference would that make to the supply chain if that was addressed? And there's 3 types of models being developed in this. One, the basic strategic simulation model, which is the supply chain, transport supply chain for all of Northern Australia, and works on a monthly time step. So it shows you all those monthly cattle movements from any location to any location. and you can, as I showed you, start to look at some of the implications of that. There's also a strategic optimisation model which complements this, which is apparently, as is well beyond me, some incredibly complex computational stuff going into this. So this allows you to say, I've got $10 million in my back pocket. Of all of that, where would spending that $10 million give us the best bang for the buck? And if I had $10 million and I happened to be in an electorate which was marginal, you know, you can sort of draw the boundary around there and say, well, in this electorate, this would be the best place to spend the $10 million. There's also a bunch of, well, several operational simulation models, and these are produced for, say, an individual, so in this case, this example here, the Townsville Port and Abattoir, which shows you on a daily, in fact, real time pretty much, truck movements, rail movements, and ships coming and going, that sort of thing. So you can say, well, what if we change the road regulations a bit so we can take road trains straight through to the port at particular times of the night? What difference would that make in terms of costs? Or what if extra rail capacity opened up so we could shift cattle by rail straight into the abattoirs? Again, what difference would that make? There's some risks, and really I haven't concentrated on this at all. I've only got one slide on it, but you know that opportunity doesn't come without risk, and history has shown floods, pests and diseases, salinisation of soils, growing stuff for which there are no markets, infrastructure problems, environmental damage, equitable benefit across different sectors of society, putting a lot of money into these big developments and then getting atrocious or negative returns on capital, and some of these things being highly dependent on ongoing government support. So we know there's some big risks, and they're things we need to address. And finally, to conclude, so the intensification of the northern beef industry offers an opportunity to fundamentally change its outlook on the future. Unlocking significant new investment in intensified beef production requires confidence, though, about the scale of the opportunities, but also the risks that come with them. And I think we're pretty fortunate at the moment that there's quite a strong political will to do something about it, that's matching some real grower and local and regional demand, and in a sense they're prepared to put their money where their mouth is by providing dollars to do real research to look at these issues. Thanks, Keith.